The Rise and Fall of Cosa Nostra. The Mythos of the Mafia. The myth of the Mafia and the Mafia themselves were for a very long time inseparable, and in some ways they still are. To discuss the myth of the Mafia, one must look towards their foggy beginnings on the island of Sicily. Although some say that they have their origins in the Middle Ages, banding together against the various foreign rulers, the most likely scenario is that the mafiosi were originally vigilantes, on an island with loose power and a very never-present government. The mafia that we think of today seems to have started in the 1860s, and they would have been the closest thing to justice that Sicilians were likely to have had. Cosa Nostra, the common name for the Sicilian mafia, meaning our thing, is structured thusly. The boss is the head of the familia, the underboss being his second in command, who will take over if something happens to the boss. Next to them is the consigliere, or advisor, who usually does not take direct part in the criminal activity. Beneath them are the capos, who have a small amount of power, usually controlling 10 men each, known as soldiers, who do the extortion, carrying out of threats, vandalism, and murder. At the very bottom are the associates, and they aren't actually part of the family, but just workers and informants, and frequently the loose ends. An important note to make is that in Italy, people can be tried in court in absentia, meaning that verdicts can be declared and court trials held without the presence of the defendant. Many mafiosi have been convicted while on the run and later imprisoned upon their capture. Furthermore, mafia association is in itself a crime in Italy. The mafia's political alliances also protect them somewhat from the police efforts, both conviction and capture. As mafiosi assure certain political figures a large number of votes, they are aided in return. For a long time, when the DC, or Democrazia Cristiani political party held power, they were greatly involved in the affairs of Cosa Nostra. Before the DC, mafiosi tended to support the separatists, who wanted Sicily to be an independent nation. Their support is handed out to whomever will assure them the most freedom and power. Nowadays, mafiosi are still known by the old title Men of Honor. Furthermore, there is usually always a man known as Capo di tutti capi, or the boss of all bosses, which is believed to have started with Luciano Leggio of the Corleone Familia. The myth of the mafia that now survives only in pop culture is of Omerta, the code of silence, and vendetta, killing for revenge, and circles around honorable men protecting their beloved boss from other families with Thompson submachine guns. And of course, in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, or as it is known in Italy, Il Padrino. During the era of fascism in Italy through World War II, Cosa Nostra was very subdued. After the war they reemerged, mostly because they offered, as they had when they existed previously, the most put-together government in Sicily. Another reason that they were allowed to regroup was because they were the least of people's problems. They had faded from the memory of Sicily, and the perception of them still mostly revolved around the myth of honor. Cosa Nostra had also aided the Allies in the freeing of Sicily from fascism. AMGOT, Allied military government for occupied territories, was hardly a structured government, and as they came through Sicily, they appointed people to be the mayors of towns to get the island back on its feet. The men they selected were done so purely on the recommendations of the priests or townsfolk, and were often men of honor. Don Carlo Vizzini, a mafia leader from the town of Villalba, was one such man selected to be mayor. Don Carlo, shown here, was a well-respected man by many, and there are debates as to whether or not he was the original Capo di tutti capi. Regardless, he was influential and high up in the hierarchy of mafia bosses. Men such as himself were well regarded by the church, as they were often not only religious men, but made large contributions to the church or church charity. The elegy posted on the church door after the death of Don Carlo is very telling. It read, "Humble with the humble, great with the great. He showed with words and deeds that his mafia was not criminal. It stood for respect for the law, defense of all rights, greatness of character. It was love. shown here at Don Carlo's funeral. However, the view of men of honor as relatively benevolent vigilantes did not remain, and although they may have started out that way in the late 1800s, they had been involved in criminal activity for quite some time. After the war, they were allowed to reemerge because they had, for the most part, faded out of memory, as they so often did until several decades ago. Yet as the 20th century progressed, Cosa Nostra was no longer seen in such a light. The Ciaculli and Capaci massacres greatly changed public and police opinion of the Mafia, just as the ruthlessness of Totorina killed the myth of the honorable godfathers of Sicily. All of these things brought forth a surge of police activity against Cosa Nostra, including the Maxi trial of 1985 and the arrests of 3 successive capi di tutti capos, among many other mafiosi. The Last Bandit in Portella della Ginestra is an excellent example of what has occurred in the Mafia in the last century. At the end of the 19th century, bandits were commonplace in Sicily. However, by the time of Salvatore Giuliano in the 1940s, they were dying out, a remnant of the old world. Known as the Last Bandit, Salvatore Giuliano, as a criminal himself, resembled the Mafia as a whole. As John Dickey said in his book Cosa Nostra, quote, "His pitiless execution of anyone suspected of betrayal gives lie to the robber prince image." Also known as the King of Montalepre, he lived mostly hidden in the mountains, staged a fantastic prison escape, and waded knee-deep in blood for most of his life. Even though he collaborated with the Mafia, Cosa Nostra was not persecuted because of their involvement, as it was not universal to the organization, and furthermore, Giuliano later killed 5 mafiosi, including the boss of the Partinico Familia. In 1947, townsfolk were celebrating May Day in the valley of Portella della Ginestra, preparing to listen to a socialist speaker, when Giuliano and his men opened fire upon the crowd, leaving 33 injured and 11 men, women, and children dead. The Portella della Ginestra massacre is in the Sicilians' mind as Pearl Harbor is to Americans, and Giuliano was found dead just prior to his trial in 1950. Giuliano's life can be compared to Cosa Nostra because despite his early killings, he lived in the myth of the King of Montalepre and the robber prince. However, after the events at Portella della Ginestra and political changes, he was seen more often than not as a, quote, wild anachronism, and became the source of public outrage. Cosa Nostra as an institution suffered a similar fate so many years later after the Ciaculli massacre, drawing public outrage for the killing, and was no longer able to live under the myth of men of honor. In 1957, Sicilian and American mafiosi met in the Grand Hotel Palm in Palermo, where they discussed the growing narcotics trade and formed what is known as the Mafia Commission, which was a collection of bosses who made rulings as to the internal crimes of Cosa Nostra and the killing of mafiosi. The first Mafia Commission only lasted 6 years before it dissolved, but it showed the disconnect between police information and Cosa Nostra. At a time when judges would only conclude that mafia was an idea, Cosa Nostra was developed to a point where it had its own internal organization. Shown here is Lucky Luciano of the American Mob at the Mafia Commission meeting in Palermo. The 1957 meeting in Palermo was also the first appearance among many of a mafiosi named Tommaso Buscetta. He played a significant part in the First Mafia War, the Ciaculli massacre, and the Maxi trial, appearing frequently hereafter in the tale of the Mafia as a highly respected mafiosi. Soon after the formation of the Mafia Commission, the First Mafia War broke out. In February of 1962, someone, possibly Casadonio de Pisa, cheated on a routine drug shipment. Although de Pisa was acquitted of the crime by the commission, he was killed by his unsatisfied partners in the shipment, the La Barberas. It became a war of vendetta. A month later, Salvatore La Barbera was killed, and his brother, Angelo La Barbera, destroyed the enemy's house with a car bomb, that of Salvatore Little Bird Greco's. Greco then had his men open machine gun fire on an associate fishmonger and hitman of La Barbera, whereafter a Greco man was killed by a car bomb. Next up was Angelo La Barbera himself, who was shot in Milan, which was incredibly significant as it had occurred in northern Italy. John Dickey. Quote, when the Mafia spread beyond Sicily, the issue moved up the whole nation's political agenda. La Barbera survived and was later arrested in the hospital for his involvement in various crimes and as a mafiosi. Several years later, he was fatally stabbed in the prison yard in 1975. That was so easily the end of the war, if not for another unsatisfied customer and an extremely unfortunate flat tire.